All right, so welcome everybody to a evening meeting of Los Angeles Audubon Society. My name is Travis Longcore. I'm the past president of LA Audubon and will be the speaker this evening. The one thing I will mention is that if you are interested in getting notifications about LA Audubon events, you can sign up at our website, laaudubon.org. This presentation tonight will be recorded and is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube as soon as we can get all that processed and up there, at which point, if you found it useful, feel free to use it and share it however you'd like to do that. So my background on this topic tonight, which is Zone Zero, I got interested in the effects of vegetation management on wildlife many years ago as a part of being interested in urban nature and urban nature conservation. It was a sort of a follow-on from some of my dissertation work on restoration and the response of insects to restoration, but also looking out at that time at the landscape and seeing everything that was going on with fuel modification, wanting to know where those rules came from that said there should be 200 feet of clearance here and there. And so it's been an ongoing topic of interest of mine, both on the sort of keeping track of the literature as well as serving on the county's environmental review board that I serve on with LA Audubon's Margot Griswold, where we've looked at lots and lots of proposals for building out in the county section, LA County section of the coastal zone in the Santa Monica Mountains that involve, post-fire rebuilds, builds in new places with high risk. And so that's a bit of the background of interest here, but I just want to give that as an opening, as sort of a self-introduction. By background, I'm trained as a geographer, and I hold an adjunct position at the UCLA Institute of Environment and Sustainability as an adjunct professor and the senior associate director. So let me see if I can get, and there we go. So the topic this evening is defensible space zone 0 and the new fire hazard severity zones, implications for California's urban forest and habitats. And I'll just say also at the outset, there are many people who are working on this, and I'm drawing on other people's work in this respect. And if I haven't named everybody, you're still appreciated. And we'll have a question and answer at the end to get into the questions that come up as we go along. So Zone 0. Quick background, what is Zone 0? Well, we'll talk about that here. Please do keep muted while we go through the presentation. In the year 2020, there was a bill at the California legislature, AB 3074, that required the development of a ember-resistant zone that would be between 0 and 5 feet from structures in the state of California. And the exact language on that is here from AB 3074. And it was to create this zone and consider the elimination of materials in the ember-resistant zone that would be likely to be ignited by embers. So that's the key phrase, likely to be ignited by embers. And this went to the Board of Forestry and sort of didn't have a lot of action for quite a while. It was kind of slow until the 2025 fires here in Los Angeles County, after which Governor Newsom issued an executive order on February 6th, in which he basically told the Board of Forestry to finish rulemaking on this rule by December 31st, 2025. And because part of the original bill also said it doesn't go into effect until the Board of Forestry does a rulemaking and gives guidance for how this Zone 0 is to be implemented. So right now, even though AB 3074 is passed that requires the development of this zone, it is not currently in effect, nor will it be in effect statewide, I should say. There are local jurisdictions for which it is, because they've done their own actions. But statewide it isn't, and it's waiting on completion of this final rulemaking. But then we have a separate thing going on. So there's zone zero is sort of the first item. The second item are the fire hazard severities, or fire severity hazard zones. And these are maps that are created by the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection that then, by virtue of state law, have to be adopted by local jurisdictions. They can't be anything less than these maps that are adopted. And they have been updated and released here in 2025 calendar year. And on the left side of this little slider is our old very high zone in this particular area. This is the Hollywood area near Plummer Park, which was our old headquarters for LA Audubon. And this was the old map like this that had a role of the local jurisdiction making the determinations of where the zone was. And the right-hand side is the new zone. And so the red is a very high fire severity hazard, and then high, and then medium in the yellow. And this is a hazard zone, not a risk zone, which is risk takes into account how vulnerable the things are, whereas hazard is like, are there going to be embers? Is there something to burn and there would be embers? So this update is really about where might embers go from a wildland fire. They very explicitly have not designed this to be an urban conflagration model. The underlying mapping from the state isn't about whether or not the construction of the buildings is the risk. It's like, where will the embers go? And you can tell this by going around this tool at the state level and seeing Angel Island Park up in San Francisco Bay. And you see that the very high hazard zone extends out into the water. And I think we can all acknowledge the risk there is very low. But in theory, the hazard is high because there could be embers that are from a wildfire on the island that then get out into the water. However, even though it doesn't take into account risk, the state uses these maps in a number of different places in order to figure out whether you can do certain developments. It's in some of our statewide housing regulations are these maps. And if you want to get and look at these maps and see whether or not your particular location is in or out of these new very high and high zones, that link, if you put your phone up and take a picture of it, should take you to this tool at the state that you can explore. And so why am I telling you about the expanded maps? They expand quite a bit in Los Angeles. I'll just give you another example here. The old map, our old very high fire hazard zone is here. This is Los Angeles State Historical Park. The LA River is here, Dodger Stadium over there. And that's the old map. And then this is the new state map coming in over it, expanding the very high zone, which is for us quite important, out into areas that are, well, neighborhoods, industrial areas, public parks, et cetera. And if we do that slider all the way over, you can see just how far down it goes. There's a bunch of places here that are sort of part of what you would think of being the urban fabric that are now in very high fire hazard severity zones, including a pretty important portion of Chinatown right here. So the reason I bring this up is because where zone zero applies is defined by these maps. There's two different types of areas for firefighting in the state of California. One are called the state responsibility areas, where CAL FIRE is responsible primarily for the fire. Then they bring in other people via the mutual aid. And then there are the local responsibility areas where the local fire department is responsible primarily, and then bring in the state and others through mutual aid. So these get referred to as the SRAs and the LRAs. And I'm talking here in Los Angeles. So I'll give our example. The local responsibility area is in the city of Los Angeles is a local responsibility area. And so in a local responsibility area, the very high fire hazard severity zones will have zone zero applied. In the state responsibility area, it's not just the very high, it's more than that that are going to have zone zero applied by CAL FIRE. But particularly important, all of the very high fire hazard zones will have zone zero applied to them. So with these new maps, there's new places that are going to be subject to Zone 0 regulations, and in fact, all defensible space regulations. So Zone 0 is just part of the state's defensible space regulation for fire preparation. It also has a Zone 1 and a Zone 2. And so places that might be applied to, this is going to be the Sunset Strip, Hollywood Boulevard, the UCLA Sculpture Garden, Royce Hall, Anderson School of Business, and dorms. There may be some exception there for the state-owned property. We're trying to still sort that out, what that exception will be. And of course, areas in Chinatown as well. So places that have maybe never considered themselves and were never mapped as high fire hazard severity zones are now mapped that way. And not only will have the old defensible space regulations applied to them, but we'll have this new Zone 0 regulation applied to them as well. So what's the proposal? There's a committee at the Board of Forestry that has been hearing this quite extensively this year, and we're up to the July draft, which has had a series of amendments so far as a result of input from the community. And I want to walk through this so that everyone sees it precisely. So no landscaping materials that are likely to be ignited by embers. Remember, that was in the law, and are permitted within Zone 0. This includes, but is not limited to, grass, ornamental or native plants, shrubs, fallen leaves and tree needles, weeds, and combustible mulches, including bark and wood chips. So that basically says no vegetation and no dead vegetation within 5 feet of any structure, no landscaping materials, which includes native and ornamental plants. Although, of course, we know that some native plants are also ornamental, but not to quibble. There is an exception, and this is how we know they mean that there should be no vegetation at all. The exception is plants in pots, which are allowable if they're in areas that are not directly beneath, above, or in front of a window, a glass door, or vent, are kept in an unaffixed, not combustible pot or container that's no larger than 5-gallon capacity and set apart by 1.5 times the height of the plant or 12 inches, whichever is greater, from the structure and each other's. And the plants can be no greater than 18 inches in height, and all dead and dying materials should be removed from the plants. So that gives us that's the exception. You can have your potted plants, but they're very specifically regulated. They took out a provision here that would have said you have to move the plants on red flag days. So they've actually gotten rid of that. The next, and this is only as a result of, I believe, activism and engagement in this process, because originally they were not exactly going to allow trees either. Now it says trees within Zone 0 shall be maintained so there are no dead or dying branches, and that all tree branches shall be maintained 5 feet above the adjacent building or roof, 10 feet away from chimneys and stovepipes, 5 feet away from the sides of any building and structure. If you're familiar with the guidelines for the city of Los Angeles, being 5 feet above the roof and 10 feet away from the chimney is already code. 5 feet away from the sides of any building or structure is a little bit challenging and would be new because Zone 0 is 0 to 5 feet. And if you have a tree that is within 5 feet and it has any branches, then it kind of is implying you have to cut all the branches off until you get to 10 to 5 feet above the structure's roof. And that could cause some pretty serious issues from the perspective of the health of the tree, its balance, and its sort of arboricultural advisability of doing that. So there's a little question that I have there. There's also an exception, which is, and this is the exact language, it states, the subdivision does not apply to single specimens of trees or other vegetation that are well pruned and maintained so as to effectively manage fuels and fuel ladders as provided in Public Resources Code section 4291. So a fuel ladder is just the idea of fire being able to make it from the ground up into the canopy, providing a way for fire to climb. And so I am not entirely sure how this exception works in practice. Single specimens of trees or other vegetation, even though the previous paragraph basically said no shrubs and no plants, but This maybe gives an exception to single specimens. Unclear to me a little bit what that's actually going to mean. Here's section 4291 of the California Code, and it's basically, it has this exact same language. This paragraph doesn't apply to single specimens of trees or other vegetation. So they're basically trying to harmonize this with the existing code that's already out there. Sort of stating the purpose is to not form a means of transmitting fire from nearby vegetation to a structure or from a structure to other vegetation. So I'm not sure we get so much more information from that. Next thing, no items that are likely to be ignited by embers are permitted. This includes boards, timbers, firewood, petroleum-based products, which, interesting history, if you go through the different drafts of this used to say artificial turf. There was a lobbyist for the artificial turf industry. Now they've changed it, who had comments. Now they've changed it to petroleum-based products. Window boxes and trellises. So that's basically saying you have to get rid of all these things within 5 feet, keep the roof and rain gutters clear of leaves and needles, and keep the areas under decks, balconies, and stairs clear from vegetative material and combustible items. The next is no combustible gates next to or attached to the building, no fences that are combustible, so that would be wood and vinyl, within, and they would need to have a 5-foot span of non-combustibility at the point of attachment. They're not going to force the removal of fences that are sort of parallel to structures at this point, but they don't want any new sections of combustible fence within 5 feet of a building or structure, including an attached deck. No outbuildings, so that would be any sort of a shed, garden shed, etc., that might be within 5 feet of a structure would have to be removed. This will not take effect for existing structures for 3 years, but all new structures would have to comply as soon as this is updated by the Board of Forestry. So there's a, if you want to call it a grace period, a 3-year grace period, and then new structures would have to comply right away. The department, this one here, the department here means Forestry and Fire, Board of Forest Fire Protection, CAL FIRE, may allow work in stages to support implementation, recognizing the fact that there's a high cost of compliance. To address the cost of compliance. This language theoretically would trickle down to the local agencies that would need to be enforcing this in the local responsibility areas as well. However, there's still a 3-year deadline. So they could maybe say, do this year, that the next year, and that the year following, but they're really looking to have all of that vegetation, all the, the fence, the gate, all that sort of stuff done within 3 years. They just, don't have to do it right away. And then they added this in the most recent draft, saying within the local responsibility area, the authority having jurisdiction may choose to develop alternative practices for Zone 0 that take into account local variation, including differences in geography, geology, ecology, city and county ordinances, and architecture. And this, I believe, also is in response to the comments that have come in from people across the state on this proposal saying, we don't think one size fits all makes sense here. And there's a lot of difference between Chinatown and Chico. So they put this in here, but I have to say, we don't know what this means in practice because they've clearly said that they want all of the vegetation gone. They have a exception sort of for trees. And then this says alternative practices for Zone 0 compliance. So for me, this is an open question. What will that end up meaning in practice? So let's look at an example of what this, right now as it written means. This is an area in Chinatown. There's a freeway right over there, and you can see that there's a park. And this is now in the very high fire hazard severity zone by the state maps. The City maps will be updated to incorporate this. And as I said, they can't make that very high zone smaller. They can only make it larger. So this is definitely in the zone. So look down this multifamily residential street, look at the green and think about what's within 5 feet of buildings. And it's basically everything here. You might be able to get away with this little planter if it happens to be 5 feet across these steps. So on this example street, 100% of the places that might have birds or butterflies or anything like that would be required to be removed under this current proposed regulation. So how do we get a sense at the scope of what's going on? As I said, there are a lot of people working on this, including the county of Los Angeles and the city of Los Angeles. And LA County Planning put this together in order to be able to illustrate where the tree canopy was. This was before the tree language got modified, but it's still a pretty good indication of where there's green stuff around homes. For the new state map, very high fire hazard severity area. So if I click on that, that should take me over here. And some of you may be interested in this. So let me see if I can get myself the chat open and put this link in the chat. There you go. And right now, every parcel that has a bit of tree cover as mapped in, I forget what it was, 2020, has a red, dark red dot. The light red is all the very high zone, and all the dots are parcels where there's some level of vegetation that is mapped in 2020 as tree cover within 5 feet of a structure. And this is done from very high resolution aerial photography that is collected by the County of Los Angeles periodically, along with a whole consortium of others. And so I'm just randomly going to zoom into this area around Silver Lake. And as you get further in, you start seeing the parcel lines, and the green is mapped tree cover, and the red is within these 5-foot buffers from the from structures. The structures, if you look carefully, the structures don't exactly match up with the implied things. That's because the base map has a different structure map than the data. The data are accurate. The tree data and the structure data are from the same data set. So as you start looking around, you can see there's a whole lot of green that's within 5 feet of structures that is potentially impacted by this. And as you go down, you get into areas that were not historically in these very high fire hazard severity zones that's been introduced for the first time that they're going to because of these maps. And you can see that they too are going to be hit by this approach. So let's see if I can switch back over here. So you can go have a look at that as just an indicator of the extent of the number of parcels that are going to potentially have to be doing something with their vegetation. To zoom in, I just put some screenshots here. Here's West Hollywood. Zooming further in, there's quite a lot. And as you get up into the hillsides, it's more. But what's important here is these very high wildfire hazard zones extend now out considerably into the urban fabric, into dense neighborhoods of high residential, where often the only place that we have for, well, habitat for birds, which is one of the things we care about, but also for shade and for the psychological benefits of having green space, is right close to buildings. So why do these things matter? It's going to affect everybody in the current and future very high fire hazard severity zones. There's nearly no properties that would comply with this right now, and compliance is expensive. It would greatly reduce wildlife habitat, especially in higher density neighborhoods, eliminate privacy in densely populated areas where you've got hedges that are violating these rules, whether it's zone 0 or zone 1 in these expanded map zones. It'll increase temperatures and associated cooling costs, especially when air conditioning units are then exposed to direct sun. This is one of the most important functions of urban forest and shade from a energy savings and expense and emissions perspective, is actually shading air conditioning units. It's some of the best investment that you can make. But if that happens to be shading something that's within 5 feet and you lose that shade, then you lose that. There are a lot of people who are not currently expecting it, who are going to lose their trees and vegetation. Property owners can get fined for not complying with defensible space. You can have a lien put on your house. And really, there's no process to appeal the determination once it's made by the fire department that inspects these things, that you can rationalize and have a process and a hearer of last resort. You pretty much have to do what the fire department says, or be fined, and they will do the work for you at your expense and charge you quite above market value to get that work done. There's also some implications for the insurance industry. We've already seen insurers in California going after people and trees that are close to their buildings. These are just 2 examples of trees that insurance companies have forced removal of. Some of these things would be non-compliant with Zone 0, perhaps because it's within 5 feet and there's a branch, even though the trunk is, yeah. So there are issues with how this intersects with insurance as well. So what I was interested in doing relative to this question is looking and see what the science says about it. What is our support? If we're going to have a policy that is this widespread, affects millions of parcels statewide, what's the science say that supports that expense? So I compiled all the post-fire structure survival studies for Southern California. I'll apologize, I haven't included everything ever for the entire state, but I started on this very much interested in Southern California, especially chaparral ecosystems in Southern California, tried to find investigations where they were actually looking at 0 to 5 feet, where these regulations apply, so that there's an actual addressing of this particular question in the scientific study. And so I'll just go through some of these, and if this feels like I'm giving you a lecture from a college class, I'm sorry. Guilty. This is kind of probably what I might do to start a discussion in a class. But I think everybody deserves to see this and to know what the major findings of the studies are. I think that post-fire structure survival studies are kind of the best way to go about this. The one criticism people have of them is that they don't necessarily incorporate whether or not there was somebody there who was defending the fire. So that's a caveat. Whether or not that is incorporated in, and future studies will do that. But often in these studies, the fire gets out ahead of the ability to actually defend all the individual structures. And so, and the fact of the defensible space itself at various distances influences how it's used. So I think this is the best way to go about looking at it, and you should know what these studies say. So this is looking at studies in San Diego published back in 2014. Landscape factors, so elevation, aspect, slope, more important than defensible space, the vegetation and predicting structure loss. Vegetation reduction more than 100 feet around a structure did not reduce risk, although it did within 100 feet. So that is, and this is a theme that we will see, there is strong support for doing defensible space. Most important is reducing woody cover 40% on the property, ensuring vegetation does not overhang the roof. And the roof issue is interesting. I've talked to John Keeley about this, one of the authors on several of these papers, and he thinks that the roof overhang is a consequence of leaf litter accumulation that then is very easily ignitable by embers. And it's not necessarily that the branch hanging over the roof catches fire, but that the branch being there allows leaves to accumulate on a roof, and that increases risk. I'll just show you, just to go even further on brand here into the classroom. This is the actual table from the paper. And one of the things people do point to this paper as potentially supporting Zone 0 because of this right here. In one of their top models, so they do a bunch of different mathematical approaches to the same data, they found that vegetation touching structure was important. But compared with housing density, distance to major road, the total defensible space, amount of clearance within the defensible space, the overhanging roof, the slope, the fuel type, it's in 1 out of 6 top models. So they characterize this as sort of weak support for that maybe zone 0 zone. So we've got to acknowledge it's there, but this is not a strong factor, and it's a lower factor than a whole bunch of other things, and shows up when you're only measuring variables within the property boundary, and your neighbor's vegetation is at the same level of importance as that. They have some advice, though, here as well, that the percentage clearance does not need to be draconian. Even on steep slopes, you only need about 40% clearance of the wildland vegetation with no advantage after that. And then later on in the paper, they say, given that 60% of that woody vegetative cover can remain, we shouldn't be talking about vegetation clearance, but we should be talking about fuel treatment. And again, this is just a way to break up the fire and give access to firefighters literally at the urban wildland interface. And I would posit that these results have very little to do with the urban conflagration once you're into a structure to structure fire. Next example, bunch of studies, fires in San Diego and Colorado, where they find vegetation not a strong predictor of loss. More important, topography, building clustering, the connectivity of the vegetation, so the wildland features, not important. 2017, looking specifically at building construction materials. Again, the San Diego fires south of us here in Los Angeles. Materials are very important to survival, including using stucco, having dual pane windows and tile roofs. Defensible space and no overhanging vegetation, which we've discussed is about leaf litter, is about equal in importance to building materials in this study. But together, building materials and defensible space, so home hardening as it's called, and defensible space, only account for about 14% of the variation in the loss of structures. All the rest of it is baked into where you're building, and how close you're building to other structures, and what the topography is, et cetera. So there are places that are just dangerous, and you can reduce the risk some. And we should never think that any of this is going to, reduce risk 90% or 95% or anything like that. In this study, 14% of the variation. Moving up to a thesis that was published out of the Thomas Fire, looking at a series of structures that were burned quite early on in that fire, found that zone 0, so he specifically was looking at that 0 to 5 foot area, explained about 9% of whether the home burned, which is really interesting. And the first study here that's explicitly includes zone 0, but no effect of the amount of landscaping in the zone 0, including oak woodland, which is an important point as we get later. And it was 1.5 meters, not 5 feet technically, so, but that's very close to 5 feet. So we'll take it. But the big thing was having a flammable fence within 1.5 meters increase. So that 8 to 9% zone 0 increased risk of loss was basically attributable statistically to the presence of a flammable fence. And flammable fences, as we'll discuss in a little bit, they do not have live moisture in them like live vegetation does. And so are consequently quite a bit more flammable, much more quickly, much easily going to carry fire. We have a 2023 study of the Woolsey fire. Vegetation around buildings explains very little about structure loss. 0 to 10 feet they looked at, they considered it, didn't even make it through the first screening for being explanatory for which structures were lost and which weren't. Building materials, environmental context, slope, aspect, elevation, much more important than the defensible space in whether that high wind fire causes structure loss. I'll give you the exact quote. Despite detailed pre-fire information about vegetation around nearly 11,000 buildings, we did not find a critical role for vegetation in defensible space in relation to building outcomes after the Woolsey fire. Instead, building materials and landscape attributes slope aspect elevation, were higher ranking in variable importance. Variable meaning a variable in the equations that go into predicting whether a structure would be lost or not when looking at these 11,000 buildings in a post-fire situation. So 2025 paper that just came out and was published by the US Forest Service. I will note that anything that's published by the US government has to be basically peer reviewed twice. When you work for the government, you have to get your work peer reviewed internally first and then externally. And landscape and urban planning is a tough journal to get into. I will tell you, I probably have 10 papers rejected from landscape and urban planning and one in. So this is sort of no debate over this having been through the peer review. What they find here is that homes with nearby trees with higher water moisture content were more likely to survive. So they had two different models, one that looked at sort of a chaparral urban system, one that looked at a forested urban system. And this one, especially for the chaparral one, having high moisture trees in the area right next to the structures not only wasn't bad, it decreased the risk of structure loss. Okay, and this is, as they note in the paper, people haven't really found this before, but it is consistent with some thinking and a few things that have been shown other places in the literature, and is quite important because the having high moisture, well cared for vegetation close to structures in the chaparral interface and adjacent, here we have some evidence showing that that's a benefit, not something that increases the structural loss. They also found that having dry, dry vegetation is a risk. And that leads us to, thanks to the studies, a little more nuance that we can think about what it is should be the rules as we look at this zone zero regulation. There's another study that's been accepted. This is from a professor at Berkeley who models the effectiveness of zone zero policies and home hardening using data from 5 California fires. So he creates models after the fact of how those fires spread. Those models, I will note, assume that vegetation moisture is driven by the weather, not by irrigation. And you have to kind of know to look at the underlying model to get at this, but basically they're not taking into account in this study, although this is common in this type of modeling literature, they don't take into account the irrigation and the high moisture content of live vegetation near structures. They assume that it's the same, basically the same moisture content as it would be under, dead wood conditions. They modeled the complete implementation of zone zero, no wood fences, no gates, no combustibles, no vegetation, and every house does complete implementation of zone zero. And they model complete implementation of the hardening, which would be the vents and the eaves and the wood siding replacement and the roof, class A roof, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I mention that is because the major driver, especially when you get into these out of the wildland and into the urban, is the distance between structures. And if an adjacent structure catches fire, that greatly increases the risk of the structure next to it catching fire. And so when he models and his team models this scenario, they apply these mitigations to all of the structures entirely and completely. I just have to say that in terms of the reasonableness of that assumption when you start thinking about it. Looking at that, they find that structure spacing and hardening are the most important factors. In other words, how far is it from one structure to another? And when you get below a certain number, so structure situation separation is the greatest. In dense urban areas, that is the most important thing driving the risk. Exterior siding is second, year built after that, flame length, ember deposited, roof construction, vent stream, then you get to vegetation separation, which is a metric of that defensible space. He goes back and then runs some scenarios, assuming that for the fires that this is applied to, that they've done no mitigation or home hardening only or zone zero only. But remember, that's complete through the entire community, complete home hardening, everything perfect on every structure. Zone zero is everything perfect on every structure, and suggest that you can increase structure survival from 20% to 40%. It's accepted. It'll be in the published literature. I have some remaining questions about this because of the way the modeling to get to the risk does not incorporate the moisture levels, the actual moisture levels of live vegetation. So what's coming from the industry? The industry points to, this is the insurance industry and some of the fire science risk assessment outfits. They point to this study from 2021. I was able to find a copy of it. It's promoted as an AI study. The AI is just to classify how much vegetation is next to structures, and then they include all sorts of different fires in different types of vegetation all across the Western United States, wind-driven fires, fuel-driven fires. Just for everyone here in Southern California, for reference, obviously the January fires were a wind-driven fire. Fuel-driven fires behave much differently than that. They don't model at all to sort out the influence of different vegetation or landscape factors, and they just present a raw correlation between the amount of vegetation at 0 to 5 feet and the losses of those structures. In other words, but because there are so many other things that vary along with that, that are accounted for in all of those other studies that I just showed you that are in the peer-reviewed literature, this is not, you can't actually attribute any of this to 0 to 5 feet because they haven't done the statistical work to figure out how much is that versus how much are other things that may vary with it or not. When you have a huge data set like that, you really should do it that way, but apparently they didn't, and I would suggest that this is not something that could be published in a peer-reviewed journal simply because it doesn't address that really basic way to approach the data. The other thing they point to is this industry report from Cape Analytics. It's unavailable online. I was able to read some serious summaries of it by them. It looks like, again, they just look at one variable at a time, not looking at any other factors, so they cannot assess the individual contributions of vegetation near structures or not. Which brings me to another point, which is trees might be a benefit in wind-driven fires, and maybe not just trees, hydrated vegetation. This is suggested in a paper by John Keeley and others from the Paradise Fire. A home that survived had a border of green trees between it and adjacent destroyed homes, that trees may act as a block, both to catch the embers and to slow the wind down so that the embers may fall out at a place that isn't your structure. If you get rid of all the vegetation, then the only thing in the way is the home, and that's where the embers are going to hit. This isn't an idle speculation. Observations been made for deodar cedar and oaks and maybe even healthy pines in a number of different papers over the years. So it's been suggested in Australia, California, Alaska, showing that the presence of deciduous trees near homes was associated with a reduced risk of loss. And then I say demonstrated in California, but it is really implied by that Forest Service paper that I just showed you, where there is a decreased risk of loss when you have high moisture vegetation right near the home. The function there is probably intercepting embers. And the people who show the danger of trees overhanging the structure, they attribute that risk to leaf litter accumulation. They say that explicitly in the literature. I'm not making it up, and it's not just a first come, it's actually published that is the concern. Which brings us to sort of the LA Audubon portion of the evening, although I think we all care about this, which is, what do our birds need, right? Why am I here giving this talk for LA Audubon? And I'm happy that there are people here who are not from LA Audubon, but we care about our birds, and there's sort of two big categories here in LA. You've got your resident birds, or your year-round, and your wintering birds, and they need habitat volume. They need three-dimensional plants. That is where they're going to forage. That is where they're going to nest if they're here. You need to have volume as habitat, volume of vegetation. And more volume needs more birds. And I'll point here to research by my fellow board member, Eric Wood, and his student from 2020, looking in the urban forest in different income levels in Los Angeles, showing that the higher street tree density you have, the more birds that you have. And I know they're not talking here about cutting street trees down, we don't think, but I just want to point out that this is more volume. More street trees mean more habitat volume. Birds benefit from native plants. We can find that birds use native street trees more, and someone needs to mute, but use native street trees more than they do exotic ones. And there are some, even exotic, not native trees that do quite well in terms of attracting either our migratory birds that come and winter in Los Angeles or our year-round residents. Not coincidentally, a few of them are oaks. All the oaks are just great species to have for wildlife generally, and having something in the same genus as a native species is better than having something that's from a different continent and in a different genus. So more native tree cover means more feeding by birds, same study. And it's not that you have to get rid of the non-natives. They're just kind of neutral. As we add more native cover, we can get more birds in our neighborhoods. And I hope I don't have to convince everybody why that's a good thing. They're wonderful to watch. They're good for your mental health. The higher biodiversity you have in your neighborhood, the more your sense of well-being is going to be, even if you can't identify those species. And that's some fascinating stuff out of the psychological literature from around the world, is that biodiversity benefits people, their sense of place and well-being, even if they don't know what all the species are that they're seeing. So the same thing holds for yards and shrubs. So study done on street trees, Noriko Smallwood and Professor Wood did this study on comparing conventional yards with native landscaping yards in the LA region. Bunch of study locations here. Some of them are not so far away from these places that would be affected by Zone 0. More oaks, more toyon, more salvia, more little apples, more eriogonum. All of these are associated with greater bird feeding observations compared with the non-natives. And I would suggest it was completely consistent with this and all the rest of, sort of urban ecology, that these are just benefits across the board from having these in yards and neighborhoods and whatnot. So those are benefits. And you've seen, so I've given you kind of what's likely to happen as best we know, what the scientific background is that supports from what I think are the best type of study to investigate it, post-fire studies, and sort of what's on the line in terms of urban nature. Last point on that urban nature, connectivity and isolated patches both benefit different types of species. And I want to note that because there is can be a tendency for people who aren't as well informed about how birds behave and other nature behaves in the city, is some species, yes, they do need absolute, got to be part of a big habitat patch. But there are other species that don't need to be part of a big habitat patch and will find local habitat patches and local spots. And even in the butterflies, if we're looking at butterflies, we'll find the planter box or the 5 feet of habitat that might be between a building and the sidewalk. Both of those are important to supporting biodiversity in the city. So distance to our natural areas matters, but there are sets of species that will find habitat wherever it is, and these areas are important. Zone 0, I posit, definitely will remove bird habitat. These are some percent tree canopy at risk within the very high fire hazard severity zones of different neighborhoods and cities in LA County. So this is from the county's work in that website that I showed you earlier. There's a data panel that you can open up. So of the very high fire hazard severity zone area in Thai Town, 33% of that is within 5 feet of a structure. For Analijo Heights, it's 23% of that urban forest within the very high fire hazard severity zone area is within 5 feet. All the way, so as we get down to Highland Park or Chinatown, 14, 50, these are significant, percentages of the urban forest that's found within 5 feet of structures and potentially at risk. How it's at risk, we don't know exactly because we don't know how this is going to be implemented. But I give you these numbers just to point out that for these areas and for the very high fire hazards severity zones within them, this could be a very significant change in the environment and in the habitat that's available for birds in our everyday lives. So as you look back at this map and you think that every single one of those red dots is a property that has tree cover, not even including shrubs here, but tree cover within 5 feet of the structure, that's a pretty significant impact. And people may ask the question now, well, what about environmental review? Well, it appears to me that this has been exempted by the governor's most recent budget, which exempts fuel management activities from the California Environmental Quality Act. I haven't had a lawyer look at it. I'm not going to tell you that's the absolute truth. There is a process to respond to comments from the Board of Forestry after the draft rule comes out that may consider some of these impacts. But in the conversations that I have seen going forward by the experts that have been brought in by the Board of Forestry and by the board, there is not a large sense of balancing one environmental impacts against this regulation. The sense is people just need to get used to it because it's what they have to do to be safe. And these are all just aesthetic concerns, and you should deal with it. I think it's a pretty big thing to just have to deal with, given the weakness of the support for completely banning vegetation within 5 feet, as we look at that literature that I just reviewed for you. So my suggestion is, sure, support the ban on connected wood fences and gates. This is well supported by the science. You saw it as we went through that zone 0 in the Thomas fire. It's completely attributable to there being combustible fences within 5 feet of structures. The maintenance requirements, the getting the leaves off and the needles off the roofs and off the gutters, all this good hygiene stuff, absolutely 100% completely supported by the science. Support the local flexibility language. I don't know what it's actually going to mean, but it went in there because people from around the state thus far have participated in the process and said, you know what, not everywhere is the same, and you need to give our local firefighters the ability to work with us and figure something out. It seems at the most recent hearing, which I wasn't able to go to, the insurance industry and some of the more virulently supportive of no vegetation in zone 0 people absolutely hated the local flexibility language piece, which suggests to me that is the right way to go. Support the change to explicitly exempt well-maintained trees. This is something that they changed in the language as things went through this process over this summer. Some things can still use clarification. Are, specimen shrubs exempt or not? Specimen trees, are they really exempt? How about the 5 feet of the branches? Maybe that gets sorted out later, but thank you to the board and their staff for suggesting that we exempt well-maintained trees. And continue, as many people who've been involved in this have been doing, to request that healthy live vegetation be permissible and not banned by default. I'm completely supportive of removing vegetation that an inspector says is likely to be ignited by embers. I think that's something that an inspector should have the latitude to decide, so that conditions where it's been, an environment that is moist, well hydrated, and well maintained, isn't lumped in there with dead palm fronds. They're just two different things, or with some of these species of plants that always accumulate a lot of dead wood and are always a hazard and are always the examples for bad vegetation in zone 0, like junipers, like cypress trees that always have this accumulated dead matter in them. Let the inspectors make that determination. I know the people who are from the fire science side and the fire and the insurance industry side don't want inspectors to have that latitude, but we should continue to ask for it. They can change it in the future if they can demonstrate conclusively that there will be a benefit of this. But right now, you look at those post-fire studies, and it just is not a strong message of support. And of course, join coalitions of interested people to engage in this process. There's one that's been put together up in Berkeley, the Alliance for Practical Fire. I've forgotten it. There's the website. Someone will remind me of that in a moment. So the status right now, the Board of Forestry Advisory Committee just met, and I just learned today from my colleague Narik Katz at UCLA, who has been putting forward some of the sort of investigation on the university side and coordination of agencies on this question of just sort of understanding what this is, that there will be a Los Angeles meeting on September 18th. And I hope everyone can put that on the calendar. I hope again, I just got a text about it today. We've been asking for an LA meeting so that people who would be affected down here have an opportunity to speak to the Board of Forestry. And one of the reasons this Southern California meeting would be so important is these expanded zones, the fire hazard severity zones, they're expanded in Southern California, but they're somewhat reduced in Northern California. So when they remapped, they really hit Southern California with these expanded zones and getting into places that have never been in a fire hazard zone before. And so hearing from people, you know, in Hollywood, on Hollywood Boulevard, or on the Sunset Strip, or in Chinatown, or any of these areas that now are subject to this, come out and talk about what it would mean to lose all the vegetation on your block, which in some instances is what this would mean. The formal rulemaking was supposed to start in July. It hasn't. If they're having a meeting in September, maybe the formal rulemaking starts in October, or maybe they're meeting, I don't know. That's a question mark when they start. It's supposed to go through December, but it is another opportunity where people can put in comments and they will need to respond to those comments from the Board of Forestry. The rules plan to go into effect January 1st, 2026. Existing structures, as I said, will have 3 years to comply. Just from one of their presentations, the cost to comply for a home in Auburn, California was $13,000, and they had to remove 10 redwood trees and a black oak to comply with what they were demonstrating in the meeting as good compliance with their vision of what Zone Zero would be. $13,000 in Auburn, California a couple of years ago, that is a heck of a lot more money than that in Southern California and Los Angeles in particular. There's a website, I'm sorry, an email address that you can go to submit your comments as well, bofcomments@fire.ca.gov. I can see that we have 42 things in the chat. I'm imagining there are a bunch of questions. The meeting got to capacity at 100. And thank you for listening so far and letting me get through that. I will take questions as you wish. Maybe raise hands first, and then someone can maybe go through the chat and give me some questions. Diana, I see that you're here. Maybe you can peruse the chat.
Yeah,
I'll go
through the chat for you, Travis, so you can take hands.
Thank you. All right, so this isn't a Brown Act meeting, which is the kind of thing I run all the time. So we don't have to worry about any of those Brown Act-y kinds of things. Go ahead and just raise your hand and we can have a conversation. No? There we go. Lonnie, welcome.
I'm trying to unmute myself. There I go. Let me put my hand down. Thank you. Muriel Coton invited me, told me about this meeting, and I'm just astounded that this was actually proposed by anyone and then passed. I have bird feeders on my deck. We live in an area that has lots of trees and shrubs. And this just is so upsetting to me to hear this. I really want to get into this and see what we can do to change this.
Well,
my comment.
Yeah, I will say this is not an unusual response.
Yeah, I'm sure
there are people don't know about it. And then when they hear about it, you know, there's everybody wants to be safe, and this and I should have said at the outset, one can support a Zone Zero regulation and still want to be able to keep hydrated well maintain vegetation within that zone 0. And so we all want to be safe. I live in a high fire hazard zone as well. But people hear this and they're like, I'm sorry, you want me to put basically 5 feet of concrete or gravel between me and my neighbor because we're 10 feet apart. And that's the plan. That's, people are dumbfounded by that. And so I from the start of getting engaged with this conversation, it has really seemed that they haven't fully comprehended the landscapes that this is being applied to, and that they have in their mind maybe the Sierra foothills on an acre. And if I lived in the Sierra foothills on an acre, I might indeed have gone to the, in a forest, which is a very different thing because forests have crown fires, right? You don't get crown fires generally in the urban forest. And if you looked at the Eaton fire and the Palisades fires, those crown fire, meaning up in the top of the tree, those are not crown fires either. The trees that were generally burned by the structures that singed them. So if I were in that situation where I did have crown fires, so in a coniferous forest, and not a urban wildland into an urban situation in Los Angeles area or Southern California, I might do something differently. But this hasn't been thought through in terms of the full import of the impacts, nor do I believe, despite the protestations of some experts and other people in the fire science community, that it has the very strong evidence that they think it does. I'll just give you one other example.
I'm going to just make a comment too that's really important, that there's no due process here. There's no appeal process.
No, there is not.
And that's just not fair to the public.
Yeah. So
I'm sorry I interrupted you, but
no, please. Thank you so much. And there's other names. So let's go to Philip and then Cheryl and then Catherine.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you if, in addition to this state process, is there also a local sort of regime that's being propounded and that we also have to be concerned about, and maybe have you on to present all the issues around that as well?
Great question. Okay, so the zone 0 rule in defensible space is going to create something that is required to be implemented statewide in the very high fire hazard severity zones within even the local areas. Now, it's for all the hazard zones in the state responsibility areas and within local responsibility areas where your local fire department has responsibility. These rules are not optional. They don't get to make less restrictive rules than these. They can make more restrictive rules if they want, but they cannot make less restrictive rules than these. This is the same deal. So the same thing that's going on right now with the maps. The local jurisdiction is allowed to make a more map things as a higher hazard zone, but not as a lower hazard zone. And this is going to happen because the state maps this time, they stop in the middle of parcels. So half the parcels in the high, half the parcels in the medium. They stop in the middle of blocks. They stop, in the middle of an alley. So every local jurisdiction is going to have to go through a process of taking those hazard zone maps and giving them boundaries that make sense for their interpretation. Because I don't think you can apply it where half your property has zone 0 and the other half doesn't have zone 0. But once this passes at the state level, it will be the law and required for your local fire department as well in the very high fire hazard severity zone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Cheryl.
Hi, sorry, I'm sitting in a dark living room. First of all, I'm kind of shaking from hearing all of this. So my questions are, I know that I'm kind of in the Los Feliz area, very close to Griffith Park. I know that for a while they were working on a wildlife ordinance for the hillsides in Los Angeles, and this seems to counter that completely. It also seems to counter a lot of, I know Laura Friedman worked on, another local and California politicians have worked on like the 30 by 30 issues and connectivity for species and stuff like that. This seems to be going against, it seems like they have, on one hand, they're saying, oh, we care about the environment and connectivity and species, and Los Angeles is a biodiversity isn't it spotlight? Fire
Hotspot.
hotspot. And on the other hand, they're saying, cut it all down and make it concrete. It doesn't make sense, and
Yeah.
we can use that somehow.
Yeah, well, thank you for that observation and question. I I feel that, you know. So this gets sort of into a philosophical interpretation of the environmental community in California. And maybe this is a good time and place to have that conversation a little bit. So the Wildlife Ordinance was a city initiative. And it is more or less stalled at the moment because it ran up against opposition from people whose properties would be affected. I think that's just what's going on. Interestingly, it did take an approach of wanting to encourage wildlife on properties in terms of requirements for native plants, et cetera, and wasn't like the nature's over there and here's a corridor and they were like, it was blurring the lines between nature, not nature, which is, in my view, as somebody who's been working on urban ecology since the 90s, is the completely appropriate thing to do, right? We should not be looking at the world as, here's our urban habitat that's for people, and everything and that stuff out there is for wildlife, and never the two shall meet. That's just not how it, right?
Sorry.
Yeah, it's just not how it works. Now, statewide, if you look at, and I'm going to catch some flack for this, but I just want to talk this through and get everybody's feedback on it, is 30 by 30 is great and necessary because it's about let's protect land and let's connect it by corridors. But it comes out of the idea that there's protected land and then there's everything else. And if you've done your protected land, you get to abuse everything else as much as you want. So your neighborhood that may support, wildlife now, that doesn't matter because we've done 30 by 30 and we've done the connectivity for that. And so your neighborhood is really for people. And if you like having birds, butterflies, native plants, et cetera, that doesn't matter because the nature's somewhere else. And so in some ways, as good as 30 by 30 is, it also becomes a sort of a model by which you can argue for densification and ignoring nature in cities. And as an urban ecologist, I think that's wrong, right? That we need to be thinking, and this is something my partner Catherine Rich and I have been talking about a lot, is you need to be looking at this at different scales, and that you need to be doing conservation at every scale. So yes, 30 by 30 at the state level. Is it half Earth at the global level? But we should also be thinking, how does nature fit into the city? How does nature fit into my neighborhood? How does nature fit into my lot? Or if not my lot, at least my block, so that we have half for nature in my block and not this boundary. Because I think if we continue down the road of just thinking of cities and densify the heck out of them, doesn't matter if you've got parks, doesn't matter if you have open space, doesn't matter if you have butterflies or birds or anything like that, you end up with less and less livable cities of people who don't care because they're not seeing it every day and growing up around it, who don't care about the big, the quote unquote big nature. And so we have to have this sort of fractal, which is conservation at every scale. And that gives a role for everybody as well. What's your role on your property to conserve nature? What's your role on your block? What's your role in your local community plan? What's your role in your general plan? What's your role in your county? And sometimes these overlap, and they're the antithesis of, we're going to have nature out there, they're going to be connected by some corridors, and then that's conservation. Conservation should be everywhere all the time because it's how we live in the world and learn to live in the world. So sorry to go on a sermon there, but it was very provocative question. Catherine.
Hi, I was wondering, with the data that you shared about the percentage of tree cover that is at risk for potential loss, has there been any projections about carbon sequestration benefit loss done by that, where we could apply a number and say like, hey, if this many trees are removed, that's this many tons of carbon that are not going to be you know, pulled from the atmosphere, which comes out to this amount of money in ecosystem services loss and so on.
Yeah.
Has there been any kind of analysis of that kind of loss that you can put like a money number to it for some
Yep.
folks who that's all they think about?
Right, right. And it is interesting that you have to couch this in different terms for different audiences. You know, some decision makers are immune to the moral argument and only hear the money argument, and you have to make, you know, different arguments for different audiences. So first of all, let me just say it is absolutely remarkable the amount of work that the county has already put into this, on the, you know, spontaneously to do what they have done so far. And this is something that there is a working group of folks looking at what would be the effects of this and sort of coordinating these questions. The question has been raised, what are the potential heat effects? And one could, but it would take a lot more. I think it probably is not doable with the funding that exists just spontaneously.
Yeah.
To ask this question of what's the sequestration, where's all this material going to go, what landfill is it headed to? I mean, this is I've heard the number 4 million parcels this would apply to. Where's all that going? Who's paying for it? You know, you could do all those calculations, but I will say again, Board of Forestry is not thinking about that. They are strictly saying, we're here to save you from yourselves. This is what you have to do to be safe from fire. Doesn't matter. All this rest that's aesthetics. Doesn't matter.
That's depressing, but thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, come to the meeting in September.
Well, can
Pat
you remind
Bates,
me the date?
September 18th.
18th. Thank you.
Hey, Pat.
Hi. You can hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I think it is amazing that they will finally be here September 18th. I have been to all but the very first meeting, and you get to watch the lobbyists interacting with the committee the whole time you're sitting there. It's worse than sausage being made. And I honestly have never sat through, you know, probably 18 hours of regulatory meetings and seen this going on, but I'm horrified. So thank God they're coming to LA. They can see what the situation on the ground is, and we need a massive outpouring for that. I have a very dumb question about the maps. Well, one observation, there's oddities about the maps I don't understand with the newly expanded zones. For example, they've expanded them north into the San Fernando Valley, which would require extreme winds from the south to blow them into that area. And I can't even imagine how they're coming up with that.
That's a
But I
great
know you
question.
have questions about that as well. This is a very
I
dumb
have
question about the maps.
Okay.
The lovely map that shows the old severity zones next to the new one. In the new one, the very high fire hazard severity zone is completely opaque. And
Yeah.
I've been trying to work with it. It's making me insane. Is there something I don't understand?
No. That's the way that it is. If you want a current map of the very high zone, you can go to that link that I put in the chat earlier, and the county's tool has a non-opaque very high zone on it. That you can go ahead and use in lieu of the state's viewer. They should have made it somewhat less opaque so that you could see what was underneath. I'm constantly going like this back and forth with the slider to try to figure out what's in and out. Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
the question is, what does that map represent? I have not seen the report under the hood that says what it does. It is supposed to, it's based on ember from places that are wildland vegetation using the CalVeg vegetation map. And having kicked around doing LA ecology for quite a while, that map ain't great, just to be quite honest about it. We topic for another day, but we need a new vegetation map for LA County that's like accurate. So there's some garbage in on the map. Then they don't have an urban forest fire propagation model, meaning they're not considering whether or not there's going to be structure to structure combustion or whether the structures are vulnerable. In fact, nothing here is about vulnerability of the actual structures. They do incorporate, they say they're incorporating the urban forest to some degree. But to me, as I look at it, it's just like a buffer around the fire zones. And they claim that there's some discussion of wind. I don't see it implicit in those maps at all. So let me be very, very careful as a scientist, I should say. I don't know exactly what's in there. I know some of the things that are the source layers, but I don't know how they were manipulated. And I share your concerns on a couple of different levels in terms of what is being mapped in and out, especially since it's essentially being used as a zoning map in other areas of the California code. It's like you can have a density bonus unless you're in a very high fire hazard severity zone. And so what I see happening is because they've expanded it beyond what is, in my view, reasonable, there will now become pressure to loosen the development restrictions in the very high fire hazard severity zones, because they'll go and look like, hey, here I am in Hollywood at this high capacity transit stop, and we should be able to get a density bonus here, but we can't because we're in a very high fire hazard severity zone. So clearly we should be able to do this kind of development in very high fire hazard severity zones, it's sort of like, it's kind of like crying wolf to some areas. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about fire safety in the city. If you go back and you look through the LA Times, you will see there are urban fires that cast off embers and cause other structures to burn that are not wildfires. And so having a city that is ready and resilient to there being fires, and not Chicago after the fire in the O'Leary's barn, absolutely something we need to talk about. But I have concerns that the maps are too ambitious and they don't communicate well over to the legislature that they are hazard maps and not risk maps, because who outside the academic community that does this has a working definition of the difference between hazard and risk? Yeah. So thank you. Muriel.
Yes, I wonder which of the state legislators should we be contacting to be most effective about having them question this process?
I believe that Assemblymember Irwin and Senator Allen are having conversations about this. They've convened some panels that involve folks from the insurance industry and fire, and me and UCLA and Getty, who kind of share my view on things. And I believe they're pursuing some ideas. I don't know what those ideas are, but I know that they are briefed on this and engaged in it because they have heard from people in their districts about the consequences of it. There are Assemblymember Gabriel, I believe, in the Valley as well, is someone to talk to about it. But everybody, I believe, should talk to your state representatives, Assembly and Senate, so that when some legislative fix to this, if it's necessary, comes along, they are ready to jump on board and represent their communities and know that this is an issue that people are concerned with. And yeah.
Thank you.
Yale?
Thank you. It's very frustrating that science, as you demonstrated, and all the science that I've seen in the previous Zooms with Board of Forestry, really points to everything that you say to the density as being the main source of fire risk. And for some reason, trees that are at the very low echelon are the culprit and will be banned or cut or eliminated. So how can you explain why this science is ignored, and especially science that talks about trees as beneficial, especially in time of climate change, where we need more trees?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I appreciate it. So the origin of this, it goes back a very long time in the sort of fire science insurance realm, where they have argued and wanted this zone close to the building to be ember resistant. And some of which, and a lot, so, and I have to like confess a bias here as I go and try to familiarize myself with the quote unquote fire science literature on this, which is sometimes out of engineering. I get a bit frustrated with it because they do things like say, hedges are a danger within 5 feet. And then I go and I read the paper, and in the paper, instead of having actual hedges with water in them that are alive, they construct a hedge on a metal frame with hedge vegetation that they've dried out with the water content of hay, and then they burn that and they say that's dangerous. Like, okay, I get that. There's very little in the actual fire science literature that's looking at, and maybe it's coming, that looks at actual real live high moisture plants in realistic situations. But just by way of saying, in the fire science literature, there's and in the fire, the insurance industry, there's been a desire for this. It got picked up, I don't know how, by Assembly Friedman for SB 3074. The one study at the time that was available that maybe could be used to support it from the structure survival side was like weak. That was that first one I showed you, weak support. And there's 17 other things, but it gets put into law. But I think there was a recognition by the legislature at that time that it wasn't an easy question, and they wanted the Board of Forestry to really think about it and decide what it was they should be banning in this ember resistant zone. As it got pushed forward, the only people in the room in the early iterations of the workshops before this year developing it were basically people who already believed that you should get rid of all the vegetation in zone 0. There was some debate over, is this okay or that okay, or politically, is it okay? But there did not seem to be, from the presentations and the changes that happened, the people in the room to argue for the countervailing values. They just weren't there, right? Now, the reason the Board of Forestry isn't saying you have to enclose your eaves and do 1/16 inch screen on your vents is they can't. That's a whole different code. That's statewide building code, and they can't enact it retroactively. So it's out of their purview. So they're like, this is what we can do. And we've been charged to do this. And in the room are the insurance industry lobbyists and people who, for one reason or another, are in sort of the revolving door with the insurance industry and maybe academia or funded by or whatnot, but not the urban foresters, not invited, not the people doing the post-fire, survival studies, not invited. And so this is how it happens. Ultimately, this is the governor's call, I will say. The governor set an arbitrary deadline. The governor appointed all of the members of the Board of Forestry. The governor, I believe, feels under political pressure to make sure that he's raking the forest, quote unquote, in California as he prepares to run nationally. And so has, I think, probably a vested political desire in showing that the state is doing something about this. And the other thing I will observe, which has been something I've observed since the 90s, is it is so easy to scapegoat vegetation. It is so easy to blame vegetation or blame even climate change or blame something else instead of taking responsibilities for the development patterns of the last 125 years. It's because the risk, the real risk, is built into those development patterns. And I know because I'm part of those development patterns, tiny little lot next to another one in a high fire hazard. I get it. I recognize it. I acknowledge it. And I'm not, but people want to believe that we have agency over these things in the here and now and that we can do something. And we too easily let our former selves off the hook for decisions that inexorably led to the condition where we are today. Would there have been trails and people up in the Palisades Highlands if Marvin Browdy had been listened to and they hadn't built the Palisades Highlands that would to burn down the Palisades? No, there would not have been, is my bet. Development patterns, where we development and how we put people at risk and how we control ignitions. But that's hard because it means you have to apply that thinking to today as well. And to the credit of the Board of Forestry, they have been clear, like you cannot now develop new residential units on a dead end that's longer than a certain distance, or that doesn't have 20-foot continuous paved roadway. And that's a hard and fast, and we're absolutely saying no. City of Los Angeles doesn't follow those rules yet. It's there, it's state law, but they haven't followed it because it's hard. It's hard to tell people in a country with property rights that you can't do what you want to do with your property. And it's hard to tell people, no, you can't grow in that area in a society and culture that has built itself, since the Industrial Revolution on the mirage of perpetual growth.
Amen.
Robin Smith.
Hi, Travis. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I learned so much from you every time I study with you. I wanted to say one thing. I think, okay, look, I've been at these meetings too with Board of Forestry, and I do land use analysis here locally. And this is all about money. This is about the insurance company and corporations just taking our land. That's what it's about. And what I saw in the meetings, I was really disgusted because I thought for such a serious topic, they were so negligent in handling the features of the matter. Like, for example, in my area, we have very serious Santa Ana wind conditions that all of us know about, that's even written about in our city's general plan and all of that. They have no mention of the direction of those winds and how they work, which I think is really applicable to this situation because of the disasters we had here recently, the wind-driven urban firestorms. And I'm really offended by that. I'm thinking, my gosh, these people are not even approaching this carefully, skillfully, with any specific skill applied to the areas that they are labeling as risky. And I'm done with this. I mean, we need to say what's really happening here. I think it's no accident that none of us know about this rollout of this new law. That's wrong, my gosh. And we the people are on the hook to be exposed to the risk, by having liens on our property. I'm hearing, I had an experience with a fire professional at one of my city meetings where I was in the audience preparing for my speech. I didn't know the fire chief was sitting behind me with his associate, and he was there to just pop onto our city council information about a prescribed burn that nobody knew about. And what he said to his colleague behind me, when his colleague asked him, why didn't you tell these people months ago about this planned burn? He said, well, I couldn't do that because we need them, quote, to agree with us. And that was, manipulation. Okay. And so I just have to say this to the group. I mean, there's a lot of manipulation going on right now. And CAL FIRE has been in a lawsuit with the Chaparral Institute in San Diego. Look it up. And Chaparral Institute won, proving that CAL FIRE had these completely arbitrary attitudes about the vegetation. Yeah. So I want people to just know about that. This is not a fair process at all.
No, and It is sadly, and with all due credit to those people in this system who are trying, and I do believe that some of the Board of Forestry commissioners are trying and trying to listen and whatnot, but this realm as a whole is very much a might makes right kind of a deal. And when I went and asked in the early 2000s, everybody I could call around the state, where did 200 feet fire clearance come from? What science is that based on? Because I could find the study from the 1961 Bel Air fire, and that pretty clearly showed that there's no benefit of fire clearance after about 100 feet. Pretty, you know, and even then, there's not a benefit if you don't have a Class A roof. I called people here and there. I called people, and the most reasonable explanation I got was that was somebody who was trying to make captain, and that people. It's basically it's what we referred to in a paper some years ago now, management by assertion. People just assert the things they believe to be true, and then act on them. And the problem here is that it is very difficult to criticize firefighters who put their lives on the line to protect us. Because they can stand up and say, well, I was in these fires and I've seen these places, and this here was a zone 0 thing and that caused that to burn, and this was a zone 0 and that caused that. And it's very difficult to say that is not a scientific approach, though. Those are anecdotes. The human mind cannot keep and balance 40 simultaneous, variables that might contribute to the loss of a structure in the mind at the same time, and balance them statistically across thousands of structures to figure out statistically which one is the important one that is truly associated with structure loss, and which one is the story that you want to tell to make sense of the world around you. Because we as humans have a tendency, for very good reason, to tell stories, and to tell stories to make sense of the things that we have. And it's a very easy story to tell. And Senator Allen told it after the fire. If people had cleared zone 0, we wouldn't have lost as many homes as we did. Now, he did not have no one at that point had any data that supports that. It's a story that was being told in support of a narrative that people want to believe is true. And so it becomes very powerful. And I do know that having engaged in issues as a scientist, you can be right and present evidence until you're blue in the face. And people can still just ignore it, and in fact, become even more entrenched in the views that they have. And so the bigger question here is, and I think more broadly, that we're grappling with in the country too, is, consent of the governed. And to what extent and how does one resist when the stories that are being told are the wrong ones, or that they're immoral? And how do you resist against those? I don't have the answer to that. I want to make you know about this issue, tell you what I think I know about it, encourage you to learn more and research more, and figure out how to engage in this, recognizing that there are people, and let's be honest, across the political spectrum, who take their positions of power and do with them what they want to do, not what is supported by a rational investigation of the facts.
Absolutely right. Thank you, Dr. Longcore.
Yeah, so I think, Travis, we might be ready to move to chat questions.
Sure.
And
onto the chat.
Just before that, I just want to say, recognize your work in this, and the antidote to what you just put out there is, I think, what a small group of us, with great help from you. I don't think we could have done it without you. Grassroots, bottom up, just trying to daylight this, just get the information out to the community. And so that's why this tonight is so important. So I'm going to ask you two questions. First was from Drew, who I don't think is here, who asked me, with watershed health, was curious as to why the SRAs include high fire severity and he believes moderate. What's the difference? Because the LRAs only include the very high fire severity hazard zone. And the second question Somebody asked Louise Parks in the chat. So branches need to be cut 5 feet away from the back deck, for example.
Okay, so why is it that this applies to moderate in the SRA and not in the LRA? That's a policy decision that's been made and has been in place for some time. I don't know the specific answer. Local jurisdictions are allowed to expand these rules to the moderate if they so choose. But they're required. I think the idea is the state is giving a minimum that you absolutely have to do it in the very high. But if you look at the maps, I mean, I shouldn't discount it. Those zones are a significant number of parcels in a dense area like Los Angeles. But it's not a huge distance between the very high and the moderate. There's just a lot that's encompassed by the very high that will be hit by this. So I think the principle, whatever the argument was at the time, is that that's a minimum that you have to do at the riskiest or the most hazardous, technically, locations. Oh, 5 feet away from decks. Yeah. Leaves away from the structure or deck. Yeah, so I think that's that. Yeah.
So, yeah, my recollection,
Yep.
being in the meetings is that the 5 feet can start from eaves, but it can also start from decks, most of which are, attached to people's house. If you have the deck somewhere else on your property, 5 feet around that deck would also apply.
Yep.
So a dream, A asks, how does the application of Zone 0 apply to fire rebuilds?
As soon as it is adopted, it will apply immediately. So that's it. So you need, if you've got a rebuild and you were thinking about planter boxes within 5 feet, and this actually gets through and is adopted by the end of the year, that this, as I understand it, will apply to rebuilds at that point.
I'm just going to put this in here for the sake of comment. Are we going to have a treeless city?
Not as long as everyone stays engaged. And there's a whole bunch of area that's outside the very high zone. This is specific to that zone, I think important. But there's plenty of work for all of us to stay engaged and make sure that doesn't happen.
So Barbara asked a similar question, and I think we answered it, Barbara, if you're still here, which is the 5 feet measured from the wall of the building or from an overhanging eave. Just to clarify, Travis, if you could, or because I don't want to misspeak, I heard it was from any structure attached to the structure.
Yes. As I read the most recent draft, I did not find language that specified that, whether it was the eave out or the wall out, except for keeping the branches 5 feet away from the wall of the structure. And so I think that this is currently gray area interpretation.
It might have been in conversations with board members that decks came up.
Yeah, I just didn't see it in the current draft.
There's a question around this, I'm going to rephrase it, which is, was there any discussion by the board of alternatives to the non-combustible perspective of Zone 0? In your
I mean,
experience?
so from what I've seen, I'm not even sure what we would define as alternatives to non-combustible. You mean different definitions of what it means? Because part of the challenge here is that the legislation says ember resistant zone. And then the fire chiefs and the insurance people and the board members get in there and they start talking about a non-combustible zone. And when I testified a couple of times, I'm like, your language is creeping. The law that you're supposed to be implementing says ember resistant. It doesn't say non-combustible. Ember resistant and non-combustible are potentially two different things. And implicit in the law is the idea that you would need to figure out which things are ember resistant. But there's a real push to to say if it could burn under any circumstances, it has to be banned from zone 0.
So Jerry asked if you could speak to the city's protected trees and shrubs. And I guess, you know, the question by some others too are, you know, are they exempted from zone 0?
It depends on whether and how that local flexibility provision gets implemented by the city. However, if you read the plain language, any shrubs that are within 5 feet, even if they are protected, would be non-compliant with state law. Only trees could be allowed. And then there's all the issues with what's actually going to be required in terms of trimming them. So there is no carve out explicitly for protected species. There's just that phrase about alternative methods and local variability that the insurance industry hates now, that is our possibility to live to fight another day over that question.
And Toyong is a shrub.
That's a good question. Yeah, probably Toyong's a shrub. It's
So
a
I have
protected tree and shrub, but yeah.
So along this
Hi,
line,
Jerry.
I have a question. So my interpretation, and sometimes the written rule and these long conversations and these 7-hour marathon public meetings, could you speak to groupings? Because the word specimen tree was put in the language most recently, and there was some exemptions for that, and then they talk about hedges, right? And then there's some talk about groupings. So in your mind, it just may be a lot of gray area here, but in your mind, from a practical application, as the rule is currently written, if a hedge is outside or a hedge is in zone 0, but it's cut back 5 feet from the structure, is it exempted? Or is it allowed?
Yeah. And I think I'm going to cite a comment that just came in from Alejandro, which is like, will the municipal fire department sort of enforce it based on their own interpretation? And my sense is the answer to that question is yes. And so the answer to your question is it's going to depend on local conditions and fire departments. By the language of zone 0 and zone 1, a continuous hedge should not be allowed because it's too big to be a single grouping. It's not a specimen tree. It's not a specimen shrub. And here we get into not just zone 0, but zone 1. For precedent, we can look at places in Los Angeles that are currently in the very high zone and have zone 1 regulations, which have these very specific rules about groupings of shrubs and being lean, clean, and green and whatnot. And I don't believe that the city has been telling people they can't have their hedges as long as they're well maintained. So like de facto, we have that. But I think from a policy perspective at this point, we need to approach this as if the policy they're making is going to be implemented exactly as they say. And when you do that, that's not good. Of course, if they adopt it, then this becomes, 88 little battles within the different cities that might have it in the region and across the state, how it actually gets implemented. But you want the best, most defensible, least damaging rule at the state level.
I don't know if this is a comment from Alejandro or just a question. Would it be safe to say that after this law is implemented, the fire department in our municipality probably will enforce the law based on their own interpretation?
I do have a feeling, as I was alluding to, I think that's what is going to be the case. But then it turns it into a local battle. It's clearly not what the statewide folks want. And then, so they're clear that they don't want vegetation, vegetation in this zone. And if you ask, and Emily has noted this from one of the meetings, they're very clear that they don't want hedges in zone 1.
Yeah.
But, and as other people have noted, I don't know how you enforce this. Just the sheer quantity of material that would have to be taken out of our neighborhoods in order to comply with this, especially these areas that are newly mapped inside these zones, having never done fuels management before. I mean, it's really staggering.
For those who didn't see that in the chat, Emily did ask Emily Lohan specifically. I think it was the second or third time she's asked that question. She got her answer on July 24th to the hedges, which was a hard no, not allowed.
Yeah.
I want to mention something at the meeting, speaking of agency, the last presenter at the 724 meeting did admit that well-maintained, hydrated plants are good. And then a lengthy discussion after that went into, well, the problem is homeowners can't be trusted to maintain their plants. Could you speak to that?
Well, it's a very interesting position to take, and it's sort of parallel to another thing I brought up in one of the previous meetings, which is about fences. There are fire-resistant coatings that you can put on fences that will last about a year. And if you've looked at the cost of replacing a fence recently, painting the fence every year with fire-resistant paint and getting it all ready for fire season, you could do that for 20 years and not be the cost of replacing your fence with a piece of custom built steel fence. And so but they didn't want to take that advice because they said, well, it breaks down after a year, which was so interesting because I went and thought, wait a minute, this entire thing about defensible space, they tell you you have to maintain it all the time. You have to, and they inspect you every year. And some places are talking about inspecting more than 1 year. So how on earth could you argue that something that has to be maintained is not a reasonable approach? Your entire premise of the entire system is built on constant maintenance and compelling people, rightfully so, to do constant maintenance. So these arguments that we can't have this because homeowners won't take care of it, it's like, well, then why are you doing defensible space? Why don't you just be honest and say you want to, pave it all? Because if you can't count on people to do that, you can't count on them to do your clearance either, can you? And then of course, oh, no, well, we can count on them to do that. Makes no sense.
I should say in the city of Los Angeles, there is currently a motion to asking LAFD what it would take to do semi-annual inspections, so twice a year. Terry asked, is there an opportunity to make this presentation to CAL FIRE? Is there a governing body above CAL FIRE where this presentation can be given that would have influence?
Yes, his name is Governor Newsom. So I don't believe anyone, unless anybody knows Governor Newsom and wants to send them the link to the YouTube, they have not invited me to speak at the Board of Forestry, despite having gone to these meetings, let them know of my background, shared with them a series of papers about this issue that they were unaware of and hadn't cited. It's clear that there's a very selective amount of information they want to have presented to the board. And that's it. So I will say, in fairness, and I'll give this one last thing and maybe we can wrap this up so that folks can get on with their evening. There is a PDF on the Board of Forestry website that says the science behind Zone 0. And so I went through and I looked at it, and I just want to leave you with this of what they have presented as the science behind Zone 0. First, a white paper by the industry, not peer reviewed, to the extent that it covers things, we've already covered the actual peer-reviewed science behind it. A paper that doesn't address the moisture in landscape vegetation, which is the Goldner work, which we were just talking about. A non-peer-reviewed insurance industry discussion of the wildfires in 2017 and 18. A non-peer-reviewed report that addresses the risk of dry wood. And I think we all accept that stacking dry wood next to your house is a fire risk. A non-peer-reviewed study of the Hawaii fire incident from a few years back. A study that looks at vegetation canopy for 0 to 30 meters and doesn't really find a significant effect of vegetation, in addition to not looking at 0 to 5 feet. Specifically, vegetation makes no difference if your house is older than the most recent statewide building code change. A peer-reviewed paper, but it addresses putting wood mulch by your house. A non-peer-reviewed study that shows how important the distance between structures is, which is not part of Zone 0. Another non-peer-reviewed paper that shows how important distance between structures is, that's not part of Zone 0. A non-peer-reviewed paper from the insurance industry. A paper that shows significance of vegetation management within 30 meters of structures, which is widely accepted and has nothing to say specifically about 5 feet. The paper that shows overhanging vegetation is a risk without disclosing that that's about leaves. Peer-reviewed paper that we talked about that doesn't look into 0 to 5 feet and looks at overhanging vegetation. And then 2 more non-peer-reviewed papers that are observations and summaries of the literature. What did they not share? All of the peer-reviewed papers that I gave to you tonight that show vegetation not being important, that well-maintained vegetation may serve as a buffer, no influence of vegetation in structure survival and in wind-driven fires, presence of deciduous trees near structures, reducing structure loss in Alaska, fair, not here, but still, et cetera, that fences cause structure loss that we agree to and is an issue, that removing high moisture vegetation might increase the risk. So they give us a bunch of industry papers, and I say non-peer reviewed because they're done, and some of them are perhaps quite good science. They're just not put through the ability for external reviewers to look at them and question their assumptions. And some of them aren't, and some questionable things get through. But the fact that the Board of Forestry has omitted a half a dozen peer-reviewed studies that are specifically relevant to the question makes you wonder how serious they are about having science inform their work at the Board of Forestry. The buck stops with the governor, and I think we should all make our voices known to the Board of Forestry going forward. Thank them for the progress that they've made on this, but continue to insist that healthy, well-maintained vegetation not be by default excluded from Zone 0. So,
Travis, I know you want to wrap it up, and I'm so glad you finished with that. And I have a adjacent question. Since there's still 67 people on this call, can I ask that question? We can
or
have
should we
5
say
more minutes.
or we're down to 67 people?
We're down to
All right,
67.
last question, Diana.
So so one of the things that came up in the July 24th public Zone 0 committee meeting from the first presenter had to do with a lot of these scientific, these reports, this research does not consider the role of firefighters, right? Fire suppression. And the reason that stood out to me is because in the recent fires, Palisades and Eaton, we didn't really have fire suppression for a couple of reasons. But one of the big ones that I more recently learned about was that the municipal systems we have, the infrastructure doesn't have the pressure to deliver the water that we have in large fire events like that. So in any of those, any of the studies that the Board of Forestry has putting out as supporting their position, or any other studies? And what are your thoughts
Yeah.
on that? Let me just,
Look,
yeah.
So I think it's important to consider that, and that different fires are likely, fire types are more and less likely to have active firefighting at structures. The fuel-driven fires, meaning it's not blowing 80 miles an hour, are much more likely to have active structure defense compared with a wind-driven fire, right? And that does need to be brought into consideration. Sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. Some of those reports talk about specifically whether there was evidence of fighting the fire or not. And there are studies out of Australia and other places that do show somebody there to help put out the embers helps save structures. However, when we're looking across these big events, 11,000 structures in a fire, the question from a policy perspective is, or actually my view is, if a strict zone 0 isn't going to protect it in that situation, in a severe wind blown fire, driven fire with highly spread out structure defense resources, then is it going to, you don't then need it when you are going to be defended in a more benign situation of a fuel driven fire, right? You don't need that extreme, because really what we're talking about is, do you need the extreme measure of absolutely no vegetation or any combustible material within 5 feet? My interpretation looking at this, and not to say I won't learn more and change my interpretation as time goes on, that's the beauty of trying to approach this with an open scientific mind, but that some access in 0 to 5 feet is absolutely important, but 100% removal of everything is not, because the conditions when that is important, when you would think 100% might help you, actually it doesn't. Those are those wind-blown fires where pretty much all bets are off. And when it is not that, having simply access for firefighters so that they can get in and fight around and defend the structure and not have 100%, vegetation, right? Or I don't recommend that. You got to be able to give people a way in. That is enough in fuel-driven fires, but that is 2 different scenarios, and they don't make that distinction in these conversations.
I would just say Francisco Escobedo did a really good job in both presentations I saw, kind of touching in the beginning of them on the difference between wildfires and urban fires. And I wish we had more time here. I'd love to make that, you explain that distinction to folks, but we could leave it at there is a difference.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. There's marathon meeting. I'll get the video downloaded and then uploaded after I transfer it to DVD and then to VHS, and back over to YouTube, I think is the plan for any of you who remember that joke from David Letterman days. Okay, very good.
What is the YouTube channel, Travis?
It's the Los Angeles Audubon YouTube. So should be pretty easy to find. And maybe I'll send be sure to sign up for the LA Audubon mailing list at laaudubon.org. It's down at the bottom. You can subscribe, especially the monthly programs if that's of interest. And if you want to get in touch with people doing this kind of thing, just go ahead and send me an email and I'll send it along to some of the groups in LA who are organizing, and make sure you get invited to some of the organizational meetings. If that's okay with everybody, it's Travis Longcore at laaudubon.org for that purpose. There we go. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you, Travis.